Hey guys, welcome into the show. We had some technical difficulties and we're sorry about that, unfortunately, but we are happy to be here. Glad to start. And I'm sorry you guys couldn't hear me. Had a couple of issues with StreamYard getting started up and had to relaunch. So I apologize for the trouble, but let's go ahead and start back up with the original intro. Today we have episode 168, digitizing debates, drawing, tool choice, node counts, and art. Again, hey, sorry for the trouble, but glad you guys are in here. Every once in a while when you do stuff live, these things happen. We had some issues this morning too with slowdowns in an earlier show and some troubles with the controls, but hopefully everything will get together as we had hoped. Sometimes these things happen, but we'll try and carry on as best we can for the rest of this session. Today, really, we're talking about digitizing tools. I know this can seem like a dry subject, but whenever I get people in who are just starting to digitize, I find that frequently, because there's this plethora of tools, whatever platform you're on, lots of what we're going to talk about today, I'm showing you in Stitch Artist because I'm in it in Brilliance and working in that software suite. You guys know that. However, I will show you maybe some stuff. Sometimes, I've got old designs that are in Wilcom, and I'll show you that too. The truth of the matter is, no matter what digitizing software you're using, there are multiple ways in which we can create art. We can create the shapes from art, or above the art as a layer on top of art, we can create the embroidery shapes that we need to fill with stitches. And because there are so many ways to do it, there can be some confusion as to which ones work certain ways and which ones are quote unquote best. And you're going to hear me say quote unquote a lot and put up the little scare quotes with my fingers quite a lot, because the truth of the matter is, though I say debate, and like I said earlier, and I always say, hey, we've got these digitizing debates, we're going to fight between these two concepts. And sometimes I'll joke around and put up the big versus graphic. It's this tool versus this tool. It's this method versus this method. But there's always the other big but that I put up on screen. And what that but is that the truth of the matter is this debate isn't necessarily a debate. It is us discussing the pros and cons and the possibilities of these tools, because the truth of the matter is tool choice, though there are ones that can work better and worse for different circumstances, there are pros and cons to each, and they are all useful in their own way. After all, if you imagine the people who are putting this software together, like for Brilliance, our friend Brian Bailey, who has built this thing, he didn't go about building tools that don't work. He went about building tools that make sense for certain uses. And sometimes those of us who are using the software will use them for things that they are not their best at, or that don't work with the way we like to work, or the way that works best for us, or for the artwork at hand. That's the thing. The plethora of tools we have available to us are there to allow us to address whatever artwork we bring in, whatever situation we're coming from, whichever tools work best for us. And like I said, today we're talking about tools on screen. We're not really getting into pen versus mouse. We're not getting into displays or setups or that kind of thing. Today, this is about drawing tools. This is Beziers versus splines. This is working with a bunch of points on screen or not. This is working with the freehand tool or magic wand or automatic stuff, whatever you're talking about. How are we making shapes? What are the pros and cons? And what does that do for us as far as digitizing? How does this make it easier or harder to get where we want to get? So, like I said, it doesn't necessarily matter in the end, because, like I say to everybody who's doing digitizing, the process that we take is maybe not the entirety of the thing. And in fact, the file is not the produce of the digitizer. The file I make is not the produce. The embroidery is the produce. Whatever it takes for us to get stitches where they need to be can be right. That can be a right answer, because right is about whether or not we get stitches that stitch well, that look the way we want to on our eventual garment or accessory or surface, whatever it is that we're working on. So when I talk about debates, yes, I still want to have your passionate comments. You get into the comments. Even if you're in the replay squad, I always say, hey, hashtag replay squad, jump in and let us know. We do want you to talk about it. I would love to see your comments about what tools you use and how, and we'll talk about it. But the ultimate truth is, though I say these are the digitizing debates, and this is only one in a series of many, because I see these things devolve into real debates, or at least sometimes real discussions and maybe disagreements when I'm online working with folks, and sometimes even when we're doing Q&As live at trade shows. However, the term debate here doesn't mean necessarily that both sides aren't equally having something to go. In fact, they really are more true debate. I shouldn't put quotes on it. We're going to present the pros and cons and things that work, and we're going to talk about it. And I'd love to talk about it with you guys too. So, like I said, should be something hopefully that you guys are into. I hope that we get something out of it. If you're curious about how a tool works or why I might do something a certain way, as a digitizer who worked for over 20 years commercially, I'm happy to share any of my experience, but I am hoping to hear from you guys too. So yeah, like I said, we'll get to it. Sorry we had some issues earlier. I see some folks who are jumping in with that, but yeah, like I said, we had some issues. Other than that, I'm getting smooth connection right now. We have all of the bandwidth we need, and with no warnings about bandwidth, we're having freezing might be on your end, but as we're here, people can hear me. We've got things back together. We're going to start talking. I'm also going to share my screen, show some examples, and explain why not everything we think is a hard debate or a rule about what should be used is probably really a rule, and why we might want to choose certain tools or certain methods of working over others. But as you guys know, because you're here live and this is a live stream, I'm very quickly going to go through and talk to a few folks who are here and say hi. We've got AJ Embroidery Apparel Gold Coast saying hi, everyone. Love it. Marta's in from Texas. Ramon is in as well. Ron is in as well, saying good day. Justin's jumping in also. Cindy King is here. Like I said, everybody, I know sound was off. Sorry, guys. Had some issues with the muting not undoing. That's the thing we've been having trouble with today is controls not responding on the end of our software. So hopefully we're back out of that. People talking to each other, love it. Andrea's coming from California, love it. Frank's coming from the UK. Hope you're doing good today, sir. No, you had some software problems of your own out there in the world. I won't say what, but I know you had them. Sorry about that, my friend. These things happen. Machines in saying good, happy Friday, everybody. Got Lisa saying good afternoon. Lisa Shaw, digitizer herself, who does lots of education. Love to hear your thoughts as well. I know you definitely have some opinions on these things. And a couple of nice comments out while we're here too. Ron jumped in and said, hey, it all depends on how one sees it in their mind's eye. How they get there doesn't matter. You know what I'll say is yes, interpretation is part of this. And I'm going to talk about that, especially as it comes to importing art. When people are saying what they want to do is just import, let's say, a vector, an SVG source of vector, and just work directly off of that. That's one of the ones immediately where I'm like, you may be in for more work than you think you are. You feel like you're saving work not drawing those shapes, but they aren't the shapes you need, and that can cause you some issues. And we'll talk about that for sure. But yeah, what I'll say is this. Whether or not we use the right tools or the vector style shapes that are used for embroidery are exactly right. I like to use minimal points for a lot of stuff, but I'm actually going to argue against myself on that a little bit today. Whether or not we use too many points, whether or not we use the right tools may differ in how things turn out, certainly. But if the eventual goal is reached, the truth of the matter is it's about the pros and cons and how the file is going to be used and how the embroidery is going to be run. There are file-based reasons why we might want to use different tools, especially if we're passing those files off to other people, if we're digitizing for other folks. But when it comes down to it, when we're making it directly for embroidery, whether you're in production, internally within a company, or you are making embroidery for yourself, whatever tool you use gets the stitches where they need to go is the tool that works, right? And that is fine. The trick is that lots of folks want to use simpler or easier or automated ways to make things work that often don't serve them. And that's what I'm hoping to get you past is when people are using tools that don't serve them, that don't save time, that seem like they will, but end up costing you in the long run. And we'll talk about all that stuff. But last few folks to say hi. Hi, Jessica. Happy to have you in here as well. Hi, Mike. Happy to see you in doing awesome work out there. By the way, love all the sample stuff you're showing. And everybody, join in as you want to. Love to talk about this stuff. And like I said, here's hoping everything goes well. If we can get our screen shared, if everything is working well today and the software will work out, we will abide, make this thing happen, and hopefully get to some stuff that I think will be interesting for you guys as far as understanding some tools. It'll be a shorter show. We're not going to try and go past the hour line if we can absolutely make it happen. Keep it short, keep it snappy, and just to talk about some of the stuff that's going on. So, like I said, the digitizing debate here today is all about drawing, all about tool choice, and we're going to address some of those tools as they are. Now, first things first, some of the terms I'm going to use, hopefully you guys know them. If you don't know them, hopefully you will get them through the process of watching this stuff and us talking about it. But things like spline and Bezier, and then we'll talk about freehand tools. These are actually just, that's a tool that's producing these lines, but a spline or a Bezier. Spline tools, if you are drawing with points in Stitch Artist, or the default drawing method for like Wilcom in general is splines. A spline method is one in which we are going to drop more and more points to get closer to a curve. So in order to get a curve correctly, we draw, usually there's a 2-point system. In some softwares, we may have a 3-point system like Stitch Artist, where you're going to say, all right, I have the segment that's coming into this line will either be a line, a hard straight line with no curvature. I want a spur of some type or a cusp. So I'm going to have a cusp point, which means on this side of the line, there is one type of curvature. If I want it on this side, it breaks. There's a corner where I can change the two different sides. They'd be different types of lines. Or there's a curve point where we drop that curve point and the spline is going to try, the line that we're drawing is going to try to bend through the number of curve points we have and make that happen. It'll try to adjust that line in order to go through the center of all those curve points, almost like a wire under tension. It's like it will stretch to fit all of the points we drop in. And to get more precise to our shape that we are tracing with a spline, we're going to drop more points, right? That's what we're usually doing with a spline. Whereas a Bezier is the classic thing you see in vector software, where we have a point with handles and we can drag those handles. And whether it's a sharp point or it's a curve point, we'll drag the handles and it will bend. The handles will show you the bend through that inclination, through that line. As the line goes through the point, the handles will bend that line and we can adjust curvature without adding more points. So spline and Bezier are kind of the two modes that we're usually working in. Even if you're drawing in spline, some software will allow you to edit in Bezier, whereas other software will only allow you to draw in one or the other, or you can switch back and forth. Stitch Artist, you can actually use multiple modes of drawing. So spline versus Bezier, that's not necessarily the tool itself. There are other tools that we can use that have these different line styles, but these are the ways that points behave and the way the lines are done. So spline versus Bezier is kind of the first thing I'm going to talk about a little bit. And frankly, I think that it's easy to say why people usually use them. I would say if we're talking about input points, and I'm actually going to bring up an actual piece of art and talk about it in software so we can discuss this kind of point usage. And we'll see, like I said, because we had some issues, hopefully we won't have any more issues with this going on. But spline versus Bezier is kind of the first thing we talk about. So I'll just define a line very quickly, not to make too much out of doing this piece. If we're doing something, if we're editing in a Bezier mode or we're working in a spline mode, it's kind of just a different way that we'd work. If we're drawing with points here and I start out and I'm trying to adjust this curve, though I'm just drawing with points, if I do it in that spline method, what I'm probably going to do is every so often where I see this curve starting to turn, I'm going to drop another curve point here, drop another curve point, and as I go, it's approximating that curve as I go until I get to the end. And maybe I want a cusp here, fine. And let's say I'm just ending that there. That's what I've got, and that's a spline method of working, right? If I want more closeness to that curve, if I go in here and I'm not happy, let's say I've done less of these points, and I say, all right, I didn't get enough here. Maybe I can move that curve somewhere, or if I don't think I've gotten, I'm going to add more points to this line. And as I add more points to this line, then I can approximate that curve better. And that's what we're doing, right? As we add more points, we approximate the curve a little bit better. But the thing with spline work, if we're working with it as a spline, and let's take this editing to spline editing instead of Bezier editing, you'll see that I don't have any handles on these, right? The editing is just me moving the points. And if I want to get a better curve or a difference in the curve, I need to add another point. If I want it to have some sort of inflection between two curves, I need another point, because the way we're going to estimate that is just to go through all those little curves, right? It's going to go through the curve points and bend as it goes. If I want to adjust something between these 2 points, I can't really adjust that line. I need to add another point and then I can move it, right? So let's say that's what we've done for the initial set. And that's also a method of drawing where you're doing the spline method of drawing like this. In this case, we're essentially just continuing to add points to get there. That's kind of how we do the drawing, and it all happens at once. So one of the other drawing methods I'm going to talk about is whether or not we draw at once or we place and edit. Like intentionally, we don't try and hit a curve exactly. We place points first and then we edit later, and that's really kind of a Bezier mode of working, and I'll show you. So like I said, this is more of the spline mode of working. It's pretty common for embroidery. Why do people like this? We'll talk pros and cons, right? So we're going to talk pros and cons throughout. But why do people like working in a spline mode like this? Because we just keep dropping points and it's really fast, right? Super fast, not working, we're not working at this thing over and over. We're not tweaking and playing. And also, if you do the draw at once with Bezier, you really can get to where you play around a lot in the process of drawing. This is pretty fast. It works quickly. If you're doing this for yourself, you're running the piece by yourself, and it's only to be embroidery, and you're not going to make a bunch of edits to it down the road, or someone else isn't going to require you to make changes. You're not redesigning anything. You're making a shape that's exactly what's on screen. This is a very fast mode of working, and most of the work I've done in my career, I've worked in this mode. I since, because I'm working on stuff that I'm turning over to other people a lot, like fonts that'll be installed in software, or stock designs that somebody is going to then tear apart. They are going to have that my working file that has my elements in it, my objects in it. I tend to now work more in a more Bezier type of mode with fewer points. And why would I do that, right? So why would I work that way instead of just doing this where it's much easier, much faster? The truth of the matter is, if I anticipate a lot of editing, as you can see here, if I really need to change this curve a lot, like I don't like the design of curve and I want it to be deeper inside of the shape of this eye, well, then I need to just go back and I'm going to start trying to fix that curve. I'm like, man, if I have to make it thinner, I sure have a lot of work to do to get back to approximating a curve again. It looks pretty rough, right? It takes me a long time to do it. And now I might not have points in the places where I need them. So that may not be the best curve for me if I'm trying to do that work down the road. Now, the drawing method may differ, but let's just say, let's take that curve out of the way. In fact, let's actually return it to its original shape. Why not? And then we'll take it out of the way and just leave that line alone as it is. We don't need that one right now because we're going to go back to a different kind of work. And it's more of it's a Bezier style of work, but here's the thing. You don't have to necessarily pull Bezier handles while you draw. You can do the method that I was showing you, or I talked about earlier, which is the place and edit method, where we place our points where they need to be, and then we edit the curves where they're going to go later. We don't worry about the curves till we're done. And on this simple shape, it's going to be quite simple to do, but you're going to see that essentially, even though I'm still working in this point mode, and I'll go ahead and make sure that I'm in Bezier editing mode, I'm going to go ahead and place my point. I want this point to eventually be aligned, but I'm only going to draw the bottom of this. The thing is, with this mode, if we're going to edit in Bezier mode, all I really need out of this is 2 points. That's all I'm going to need. Why? Because if I'm working in Bezier editing mode, I now have these handles. Here are my handles. I can either adjust each handle till I get there, or let's back that up again. I can also grab that line. Once I have the handles pulled out, let's say I do start a little curve here. I can grab the line and I can start to just pull that line into position. And why would I do that instead? Well, yes, that means I'm tweaking these handles. But as you can see, if I just want to change that curvature a little bit, I can grab that and move it around as long as I'm not adding any more inflection points. Like I'm not wanting to make the curve change in the center or have something else going on either side of it. If it's a single smooth curve like this, I can now take a handle and get closer to maybe something that is number one, a continuous curve, and that is going to be inside of that shape, kind of like the one I was showing you as I was dragging each individual point. It makes that shape a little easier to move pieces around if I don't have that many points. So that's the other thing that we talked about, right? Minimal points versus having multiple points on that same line. Why do some people choose to do this minimal point placement? It's because, well, number one, it's very much easier to edit when we have that minimal point placement, where we're just doing that stuff, or prime point placement. We can talk about that also. It's just where you put the points exactly where they should be to make your curve. And it means that when we're working on that stuff, we just don't have that excess of points, and we don't have a chance for something to go wrong with these points. Sometimes if you have either bad vector or something that is not really formatted very well, we may have a point that looks okay. On screen, line looks okay, but what we don't see is that really small point is actually reversed, and we're going to get something weird because on screen, that doesn't look that weird. But what we actually know, you saw me do it. I've got a weird reverse point here. And if someone has used auto tracing software, is importing vector from who knows where that might have used auto tracing software, or it was drawn very poorly, imagine the software now trying to figure out what to do with that. It might work, it might not. And as you start to edit, you can see weird things happen because you start pulling these around. And until you start to check out your handles and see what's happening, you don't know that you've got a twisted node here. Or you might have some other weird corner pop up because when we're zoomed out, it looks okay. But when we get really close, we're like, why does that look so weird? We're zoomed out. You're like, all right, the line looks fine. If I don't turn it back into a line instead of that stitch line, you're like, that line looks okay. I'm really not seeing it. I imported it from this, from some art. It looks okay. I click it. Maybe the points are there. Maybe I don't really notice those points are overlapped. But then I try and use some other stitch type. And you're like, why is that stitch type looking weird? Why am I seeing this strange thing happening here? I have excess points here that are telling the software, I want to turn and move through that line. I need your stitch line, this border that I applied to it, to go through these points. And if you can't see this doubled point until you're zoomed in at 6,000%, you might not end up with something nice. You'll end up with something that doesn't look so good. And instead, if we had our points reduced or eliminated, or if we were using a curve, we now know we don't have any other weirdness that's going to interfere with the generation of our stitches. And it can cause, depending on the engine, depending on the software, it can cause all manner of things to go haywire if your input is poor. And that's the thing. Just the same as drawing something with tools that might make that input better or worse, when we're importing things from other software, we're importing, let's say, this SVG, which is what was created for this original file. If we do a vector import instead of drawing our own shapes, we might get shapes that have that sort of stuff going on too. In this case, are these bad shapes? These are pretty good. They're not terrible. If I take this shape and I apply, if I apply stuff to it, I go ahead and apply these settings to it. I say, all right, I want a satin stitch. The chances are this shape is not terrible. It's not the end of the world. It doesn't cause any haywire stuff to happen. Certainly, we're getting some weird shape stuff because we have curves at the end instead of a flat line. If you wanted this to end in one flat stitch, well, having this curve that was in the original piece is not great for you. You're probably going to have to edit it. But this is a very simple shape. If we bring in something where we auto correct it out of a photograph, you're going to get something very different, or something that has multiple colors or is a full color rendition. The kind of shape you might get is very different. And admittedly, though the shapes are okay, they're not really what we want necessarily for embroidery. And I'll show you the eventual piece to show you some stuff I'm talking about. If we look at some of the shapes that are present, these two pieces of this feather are one big slab. So when we're drawing this shape, if we import it from vector, it's going to be one piece. And the edges of these outlines are going to be right on top of each other. And there's not going to be any adjustment for pull compensation or push compensation or any of the things that have to happen in order for things that are overlapping to line up once you run them. We all know satin stitches get narrower as they run, and they stretch out. They get taller. If you had a vertical column of satin stitches, it gets taller and narrower as it runs. And we know that if we want a border, a satin border, to go on a satin feather that's coming out of this helmet, we know that eventually we're going to want that to have some overlap here, right? And if we want that overlap, or if we want these two satin strokes to be separate, maybe we want two feathers overlapped instead of the one that's shown here, then automatic conversion, even good tools for it, isn't really going to give us what we want, even on a very simple graphic like this. And this is an incredibly simple graphic. This is all color blocked. There is no shading. This is not photographic. Nothing else is going on with this piece. So we could ostensibly use something like we have this magic wand over here. I almost never touch it, I'll be honest with you. I'm not a big magic wand guy. If I click in here, I get a shape that is reasonable. It's not terrible. It does have a really sharp point here that doesn't make sense. It is not overlapped out into the outer areas where I'm eventually going to have a satin stitch border. It has curvature on the end that I might not want. And if I wanted to split this, I'm going to have to do that manually. And that's with a very simple shape that traces nicely. And I'll also say, honestly, the curvature up here needs to be edited because I'm getting cusp points that are sharp because the art is not perfect, even though it's good art. We can certainly work on the sensitivity of the piece. We can work on the tool to try and get a little bit better. There, I've got some curves that make a little bit more sense. But even then, I may have some extraneous points that don't need to be there that I'm going to have to edit. So yes, I'm getting not to draw it. But then when I go to draw this shape, when I work on this shape, the next stage is definitely me editing. Now I'm going to go in and have to edit all my points, work on my curvature, and get what I want out of it, and do things like get my edges out where they're going to overlap into the next piece, where they're going to be under the border section so that when I do my satin stitch border, it's out there at the end. Also, these points are too sharp. If I want to cut those off and have my satin stitches go out to the edges, now I'm adding points. I'm doing this. I'm clicking this bit. I'm probably splitting this across because I want to have, I'm trying to get a point to make this into two satin stitch pieces. And now I'm going to have to break this across. Now I've got a new shape, and that doesn't really do it. Those aren't overlapped either. So now I'm editing these shapes too. So could I have just drawn the shape that I actually needed in the same amount of time instead of trying to make these overlaps? Maybe, right? Maybe I could. So let's just quickly, I'll show you the actual piece. this is the actual piece. You can see it actually has 2 satin stitches here. So this is a smaller version of it. So this rendition certainly has a little less going on than you might expect, but it has 2 satin stitches with a full satin border with cornering. And it's not going to be made out of any of the shapes that I'm getting out of either tracing here directly or out of the vector, which actually in the case of this particular vector was missing a piece when I grabbed it. So this is why I did go. You can tell this was a nice vector artwork at some point, but the vector they sent me was broken, was missing some pieces. And it had another interesting thing going on. If you want to take a look at this, this was done for print art. The original piece, they had flattened it. And what I mean by flattened is all of this white that is touching is put together. And this is not a border that has 2 outlines on it. The white line, if we look at this, number one, the white is a single slab, so it's connected to the R and the T. That is not what we want out of embroidery in this case. And actually, because I was changing the text that was under it. But if we also look at this, this is a full shape. If I try and fill that shape, it goes under everything that's inside of the helmet. This shape is continuous. If you just grab this thing and fill it with stitches, it will fill everything underneath the entire helmet. It's not producing you a border, though it looks like we have a nice border here. If you want a satin border, you will be drawing that yourself or knocking these things apart and trying to separate them from the art that's down here, from the R and the T. Is that always the case with your vector? No, this vector is built kind of poorly, or at the very least, it's been processed down, very likely for print or for something like vinyl cutting where overlaps are not happening. You know, it is kind of upsetting to mess with that stuff. And the sharp points, this is something I'm actually going to bring up a good comment here. I love this comment from Mike because it's absolutely true. Really sharp points at the end of shapes like that will often cause stitches to fly out of them because the generation can get weird depending on what tool you're using. Sure. Mike says, I always get annoyed with doing a zigzag tack down or something. Those sharp points shoot a stitch way out for no reason. Then it's trial and error to square it off without making the path go the wrong direction completely. Yeah, sometimes the inflection points at the end of this are very hard for processing to handle, for the stitch processor to not do that. And you'll get things like some underlay sticking out of weird sharp points, or those reversed curves like I showed you where the point is twisted. That can cause things like underlay sticking out. That can cause things like those zigzags going off track. That can cause things, especially at the sharp points where it's trying to calculate how to address the edge of that shape without overlapping on other areas, especially with auto cornering that happens with those border type stitches. It can be difficult for the software to find where to put those stitches without causing problems. So like I said, there's weird things that we do to fix that, and a lot of it's manual drawing. So this was a file that I did in some older software. I am going to show you some stuff that's in Stitch Artist as well. I'm going to very quickly show you the actual objects on this piece in Wilcom because it was one that I did way back when. So it's got some Wilcom stuff, and I want to show you the original objects. I didn't have those in a way to show you easily otherwise. So let's bring that thing up real quickly, and I'll just show you what some of those original objects look like, because the object creation really is very similar, but I just want to show you what I actually ended up with. If we look at this actual object, and hopefully it is decent enough on screen to let you see what's going on, this object does not have those same kind of sharp points, and you'll see that these two objects, eventually they were overlapped. The two objects that make up the two feathers at this bottom of the helmet, I wanted to give it some more pop, some more lift and dimension. And in order to do that, I actually have the lower feather is under the upper feather, and they are two satin stitch objects. And you can see that there's actually 3 full satin stitch objects that make up the feathers in the helmet. If I grab that piece and move it out of there, out of the stack, got a little bit of stuttering going on from the software, so I apologize for that. But you'll see that that's the actual object, and above it is this secondary object. No part of tracing or automatic importing would do that. And you can also see, and I'll bring them back in so you can see why it was done so. As we get underneath those borders, and sorry, like I said, there's some stuttering going on my part, so I apologize for the issues there. But as we go under the borders, those points that you see, they're cut off. And it's a little harder to see here, but I'll try and grab the points here. You can see that if I turn those stitches off, the points on the shape are cut off so that under the borders, they actually stop early. Because we know that it's going to push in this direction, I cut off those sharp points because they're going underneath these borders. Now, these aren't the cleanest borders. Once again, I always tell you guys, even though it looks like the stuff looks super clean when you're stitching, when you do spline entry, you can have excess points in there. If nobody else is going to edit it but you, and it's not likely for those shapes to change, having some excess points in there is not a sin. You can make it work. This is not the kind of excess points that causes stuff to go wrong with the software. The kind of excess points are like the ones I showed you in the other pieces, where when you have those twisted points or doubled points, where when we get in there, we end up with an excess point that is either twisted, doubled, or otherwise cause the inflection to break. So let's say we had this again. I'll just show you. Twisted node looks like this. You can find that even though the line looks good, the handles are wrong. And with the handles twisted like that, we can get weird generations sometimes, especially if they're just a little off angle and it looks like the line is okay, but it's not entirely okay. You'll find that then if you apply a border to it, there's weirdness around that twist if it's twisted enough. And or you'll end up, like I said, doubled points certainly cause it worse than that, where we end up with a doubled point. Sometimes you can end up where you get that little change in inflection, which will change stitch angle, even if it looks like these 2 points are fine when they are together. Like if we zoom out and you can't really see them as well, it looks like they're not so much of a problem. But when we apply a border to that shape, you'll see actually quite a large problem happening when we have these 2 points right together. It will mess with that generation until one of those points is removed. So doubled points, twisted points can cause that issue. Now, this is a very poorly refined shape, so you're seeing weirdness out here. But why are you seeing weirdness? Because this thing has not been properly made, and definitely not made for this incredibly wide 3.5 mil border. It makes it look even worse. But like I said, it's that weirdness of inflection. It's these curves that don't really matter to like print because you won't see, you'll just see that color come to the edge. But when we're trying to generate stitch paths off of those curves, or if we don't want curves at all, here we have a curve point that when we draw it in, it really should have been a cusp. Now we can adjust that. Now we can refine those curves. But as you can see, coming directly from imported vector or from tracing, we can have those kinds of problems, right? We can have those issues invariably that will cause us to have weird generation. So like I said, there are reasons why we might want to choose other tools. We might want to choose doing minimal points. We might want to choose using Bezier style editing to make it easier to edit or to get a cleaner output, right? There are reasons to do that. And the other reason we might want to do it, believe it or not, is if you're someone who's doing applique or cutting with that same file, you may find that doing applique or cutting, that you want to have a very clean vector because you're going to take points out of that vector and you reuse them for cutting, or you're drawing something that will be cut on a plotter cutter. And having weird points can also cause weird motions or slow cutting when you're on, let's say, a plotter cutter. If you're talking about like graph tech in the commercial world, printing cuts of any matter that you have, like Brothers Print and Cut or any of the others, the Crickets of the world, these different things, the physics, whatever, they can respond strangely also to those reverse points, to doubled points, stuff like that, or to having tons and tons of points making up a curve. And if we're outputting something, let's say, like I said, we're drawing a shape for applique, so we've got that applique border on it, and then we have those points. We have too many points or weird corners or reversals. We can end up with stuff that causes weird output at the cutter, or even cutting that doesn't go very well, stutters, jumps, things like that you might not want it to do. So smooth lines can be good for that. But like I said, it's really about the tool choice in this case isn't saying one or the other doesn't work. Certainly like spline versus Bezier, absolutely spline versus Bezier. Now, I've got freehand in here to talk about that in a minute, but the different methods of working too. Working with multiple points along the line versus working with fewer points along the line is more about editing choice, the ease of creating a very smooth curve. Bezier makes a very nice, smooth, continuous curve in a way that spline has a harder time doing. You'll end up with these little lumps. Does it always matter to your final outcome? Yes and no, it can, but it might not, especially if it's at a micro scale and you're looking at this thing from any distance. And by the time you're sewing it in the real world, thousands of stitches through a piece of fabric, which is flexible, which moves and stretches, small variations in points aren't going to matter. What does matter is things like that weird generation where it's causing stitches to go where they shouldn't be, where it's causing you to get weird fill action, where you're having stuff that's hard to find, problems with editing. And freehand can cause some of that stuff too. And I'll go ahead and just bring in tools one more time. We'll go ahead and go back into this file. We've got other files we're going to look at and other stuff we're going to check out briefly. But in this case, let's just go back to our original piece here. So here's our knight, and let's take off this stuff. Like we have our one that we did kind of in a spline method, right? So we did that spline method. We got a fair number of points in here, but it works, right? It gives us the same curve. We've got our very minimal point placement method here. Minimal points, we have 2 points. That's all we need because we're going to make that curve and it turns out just fine. Neither of these is bad. And in fact, if we're applying stitches to them, here's my stitches on this point. Here's my stitches on this point. The one thing you may notice is there's probably a slight difference between them based on where the nodes are, because if we add more nodes, we're probably going to get more stitch points. But in this case, because these are all curved nodes, and curved nodes don't force a needle land, something to understand is that when you have a curved node, the generation goes through that node. It doesn't stop. Whereas if I drop in a hard node, or if I turn these into hard nodes here, line nodes, you're going to get a needle drop right at that node, right? So that's something to also understand. It might be a reason why you might use curves versus lines, but either of those can happen. That node choice, that is in either spline or Bezier methods. Like I said, Bezier methods of editing and drawing are really favored by people who know vector and people who want to have smooth curves without a lot of working on those curves, a lot of editing. Whereas spline is for fast drawing over a piece of art that is not going to change, that you're not doing design work on so much. Then honestly, spline drawing like this, dropping a bunch of points is very fast. And also, I'll say this, I find that lots of folks who work with pen, who if they're doing a pen and they're the kind of folks who just like to rattle off points really fast, a lot of those folks like spline, and they will sometimes like freehand. Though what I'm going to say is, and I'm drawing with a mouse, so my freehand skills are going to be lame right now. I'm just going to admit that ahead of time. Freehand does have some processing, and yeah, I am doing a poor job of it. But let's say I'm drawing that curve freehand. Because of the processing and the size of this curve, that's not terrible. I can now edit that. No big deal, right? If I start doing like complex curves, though, you may get less wonderful results because we're too small. And so the processing may filter it. Depending on your software, you might be able to adjust that processing. But freehand does have some assistance and auto processing involved. And doing freehand lines, it looks interesting. You can play with this stuff. If you want to get it real close to that curve, you're just going to get a lot of little points. In this case, these shapes, they're going pretty okay. It's not a big deal. They're certainly not going to take into account things like stitch angles, or a lot of the times I will add flats on my stitch angles so I'm not having things push out or try and generate really small stitches like we talked about down into a point or down into a curve. If we had the stitch angle, across this at this kind of inclination, let's say I grab an inclination and this is what I'm doing with it. If I grab an inclination line with this piece and place that inclination here, we would have it across this line, then fairly obviously, any stitches that go up into here are going to get pretty small as they try and fill that little bitty space, right? And depending on how big I make this, I'll actually make this a bit smaller to work with it. You might end up with issues as far as dealing with that piece, right? So you might end up where if we fill that area, we can get some issues up in that corner. They're not terrible issues, but we might just have occasional issues with trying to get those little small stitches that go up into that final corner. And sorry, we got a little bit of jumping on the screen there, so I apologize for the issues that I'm having there. But like I said, we might have some concerns with that getting down to that little corner there, because as we fill along this line, as it goes closer and closer to that curve, especially if that curve pulls out and becomes kind of small toward the end, we can end up where that curvature can get very, very tiny and not actually work for what we're trying to do, especially if we draw very small points that have that curve at the end. We're trying to still generate a single satin or a single stitch into this really small space, and we'll end up with some weird generation that can happen. Sorry, I've got some hopping around from the screen. So if you're seeing some of that, I apologize. That is just the problems with live broadcasting on the internet sometimes. So I apologize. But yeah, freehand, does it work? Yes. If I'm trying to do precise work, I probably wouldn't. If I was doing freehand work of any kind, it would probably be on something photographic. And even then, I'm going to be honest with you, when I get down to it, there are edits that I'm still going to make. Like if I'm working on something like this, right? And we'll talk about this really briefly. This is something where I started with, yes, a fairly plain piece. This minor, it's one that I love because it's where I take something that is photographic and I've done it in 2 colors. And it works out all right. I'll show you what the actual final piece looked like really briefly so you can see it. It's an old piece of mine, but it's one that I like to show for kind of reducing color and reducing detail and still getting something interesting out of it. This is what the final piece looked like. But you can see I'm using just 2 colors. I've got this bronze color with a light old gold color on top to make all of this shading out of satin stitches. But what I'm going to tell you is if you're working on this, yes, could we use some freehand pieces? But in the end, I'm still working with stitches, and stitches, any block of stitches will have two flat ends, because stitches are a straight line no matter what you do. I can go in here, grab a freehand tool, and do some drawing. If I think that I'm doing this piece right, I go do some drawing on this piece, and maybe I've got something that's pretty close, not too bad. It processed down, so I might have to edit it. This is probably not the end of the world for freehand. It's not so bad. If I take this piece, it's fully closed, I grab some outlines on it, and I generate that as a satin stitch. That's not going to be a bad generation. It's not terrible. It's got some issues with it because I've got some extra points here that I have to deal with. So I deal with my extra points, and okay, generation's not terrible. I'm getting some short stitches as I get down into the curve, but nothing egregiously bad has happened here aside from me just not paying attention to the scale of the piece. I can use that, and that's fine. That's something where the softness of the line, the precision of the line might not matter as much, because it is really me kind of aping this shading, and I'm really making the decision for how it's supposed to go. But as you saw earlier on the knight example, if I'm trying to make the eye on the knight, if I'm trying to draw this piece here, just because I'm using a pen tool, and like I said, I'm using a mouse and I'm doing it over an internet stream, so obviously it's not going to be a fantastic work on my part. But I'm just not going to get the precision I might want. And for anything graphical, yeah, the shapes are okay, but I'm definitely going to have some editing involved in the end. And I'd probably rather just draw the points at the corners and work on it myself. Luckily, the smoothing in the software is actually doing better work than I gave it credit for. At the same time, would I do this freehand? Yeah, probably not. I'm going to want to control all my angles and stuff. I'm going to want to deal with this myself. And it's got points that I probably don't want in it, but no more than a spline job. But certainly, like I said, I'm probably going to change that and work it out. Freehand is probably not the best tool for this. It just means extra work. And especially if you start doing stuff that's really complicated, or shapes where we're doing a bunch of reversions like we have back here, you may or may not love little thin lines drawn with freehand, because it might just not do the job for you. And I'm going to do a tremendously sloppy job of this while we're on stream doing it fast. But like I said, I don't like this for freehand. The tool's doing better than I could have given it credit for, but at the same time, it's definitely going to be me going back through here, closing this piece off, working on the individual pieces, and having to make it fit for what it's doing. Is it terrible? Absolutely not. Can I make it work? Yes, I absolutely can. Would I recommend it for these shapes? Yeah, probably not, because it means that I'm going to do some clarification on the back end, and because I'm going to have to still do all the editing I would have done. Whereas I think for me, I would have probably wanted to do the place first method. And also, if we look at this piece, if you don't want to do automatic cornering into these corners, you want to do the cornering yourself, you're actually going to end up with a piece that has multiple objects in it. And if you have multiple objects in it, the chances are you want to draw those yourself. And like I said, if you look at the original piece that we had for this one was done with multiple objects on some of that type of stuff. Like over here in these lines, we actually have multiple objects in these lines. And each one, if you see it, that's actually a separated object. Let me see if I can grab it while I'm streaming and actually get a hold of it. Today, like I said, everything's hopping around on the stream pretty badly. But you can see that is what we've got. We have an individual line. I've actually built all of those corners out myself from overlap satin stitches, right? So that's kind of the concept I'm talking about. You may want to do that yourself. And even if you look at this, the New Mexico Minor that I have here, honestly, yeah, freehand's okay for this. But at the same time, I may want to control some stuff. I may want to play with stitch angle in a way that causes me to do some extra editing. And in that case, though freehand is fine, chances are I'm going to use another method. If you look at these ones, they're pretty dirty. Why are these pretty dirty? I did these in the spline method. I didn't expect to do a ton of editing. And because it's rough, it's intentionally kind of rough. I don't have to worry quite so much about super, super clean curves on everything, because the concept is for these to be rough. Where I will use something not freehand, but where I will use manual stitching or just click and point, is stuff like this, where I'm drawing these shapes and I don't want a precise necessarily fill. I want some lines, but they can be a little rough. I'll probably just draw those lines out, click, point, and drag. And I may even drag the curves as I go. And to show you what I mean by that, we'll go into the knight example one more time. Let's go ahead and grab our little friend, the eye on the helmet. Let's go ahead and take off this last object that we have so we don't have to mess with that. Let's take that line out of there if we can. If, of course, StreamYard will let me do what I want to do. And we'll go ahead and grab the Bezier style point. If you want to talk about drawing while you go, you can draw and play with curves as you go. In the case that you're doing that, you're usually not going to do a 2 point line here. If you want to drag your curves as you go with a Bezier, you're usually going to have a central portion of the curve and drop a curve point, and then you're going to end it with a final point in this case. And that's fine. In this case, I ended up with a cusp. I actually want a curve here. That's not a bad thing to do. I have a cusp here as well. Then you end up with this central point, and you can do inflections then, right? You can change it and have it come out and back in once we have that point here. And it's still pretty easy to edit, though it is less smooth than that the single curve that comes from both sides. But that's something you can also do, is drag those curves as you go. Like I said, for my money, if I'm doing this myself and I want a really perfect curve in there, chances are these days I'm probably just going to do point placement. I'm going to go ahead and put the correct points where I want them. Usually I would draw in a different order. That's not quite as critical in this particular shape. But you'll see I already have a cusp here. So I started with a line. I have a cusp point, line point, line point. It means that anything going into this line from this direction will allow me some curvature because I have a cusp. Drag the cusp points in, and I'm pretty well good. And also, like I said previously, if we have a curve like that, we can actually grab the point here and drag it. And if we're working on it and we want to fix those handles, you can fix the handles by using a control to fix the handles and only keep it on that same curvature. But like I said, we now have the ability to kind of adjust that curvature. But it depends on the shape. Not every shape is going to require that. And often, like I said, if you look at my older work, a lot of these are going to be done, like I said, in the spline fashion. Got lots of points in them. In this case, some of these are converted, so they've got way too many cusp points. These should really all be curve points in here. Luckily, I can do that quick as that. Those curve points, like I said, curve points are just continuous. Cusp points have a corner. That's the only difference between those. But like I said, having more points is not necessarily bad. Having too many points stacked on top of each other, they're having points you can't see, having twisted handles, those types of things will cause generation problems that make things actually turn out poorly. So like I said, it just depends on what you're doing with the piece. I've got a couple questions here, so I am going to go ahead and grab a couple things while we're talking about it. But sure, I've got AJ asking a question really quickly that I think is fine to ask as we're going through this. Slightly out of subject here, but hey, not a problem. Can I ask what your thought process is when deciding to shade an illustration? Actually, yeah, it really depends on what I'm trying to get out of the piece and what limitations I have from the work that I'm doing. I will use multiple colors to do a smaller range of color if I need smooth shading. If I'm in the case where the smoothness is not as critical, if there is a higher contrast, I might not do anything more than do like what you saw with the mining piece, where the shading was done largely with line work and not trying to use extra colors. I didn't bring in a third color on that piece because I didn't think it was really necessary. As far as the gradient from, or not the gradient, but the palette going from the bronze to the gold, pretty simple stuff. I didn't worry about having a third color there. If I have to have more subtle shading, I will bring in another color. But you can do any method of shading. In fact, I don't know if I want to bring in a ton of this stuff since we've done other shows about shading, but I often will use kind of a median color and use low density fills to create it. And that's something I think I can grab you something. So I'll see if I can get that without causing a lot of trouble here. But yeah, if I can get you a piece to show you, I'll try and show you. But at the same time, it's one of those things where it's like, it depends on how I'm going to build the thing. It depends on how many colors I'm willing to run for a production method. A lot of my old files were run on 6 and 9 needle machines. My earliest files, 6 colors was the max. My later files, 9 color was the max. And then I went on to 15, 18, 24, as many colors as I have on a head, depending on what machine I'm running. But even then, for the sake of efficiency, because I'm running commercially, you got to remember that I'm a primarily business to business commercial guy, at least in my origin, whether or not that's all I do now. Most of my stuff is going to be about efficiency. So yeah, no apologies necessary. Look in the replays for sure. There's some good stuff there, but I was trying to not drag too much stuff up on screen because we've been having some slowdowns here. I'm going to go ahead and try and grab you something to see if I can do it quickly. It's one of those things where, we don't always have the ability to do everything we want to do for it. But let me see if I can grab something because I think it's worthwhile to take a look at it if we can. But like I said, it's something that we may or may not always be able to get into. But yeah, I can show you just a little bit of the shading and just make the difference between shading manually with stitches where I'm drawing it myself, or using light density fills. The ultimate truth is either way is a way to put lines of thread together next to each other that have some spacing between them to show detail, to show color through. If I use a fill, so I draw a block and the fill is open, it has a light density, I have a shade. That's shading and that's fine. If my shape is simple enough, if the curvature of the fill is something where I'm not going to change it and the lines are fairly parallel, I'm not trying to do shading that has a break up motif that has like a vermicular pattern. What I mean is like it looks like little worms, it goes back and forth. If I'm not trying to break up those lines or use some sort of texture, then a light open fill is a great way to shade. And the other thing, truthfully, while I'm working, if I find that I'm doing connecting stitches or something where I'm already doing manual stitching work and I only need a very small amount of shading and I know that the number of clicks isn't very much, I may just shade with manual tools, which is actually what I did in the other piece here. So I'll bring that up and we'll see if I can grab the other one. If I can't grab the patch that I'm thinking of, I won't. It's just one of those things where I may not be able to grab that original as quickly as I would like to. If that happens, then hey, that's fine, and it's just something that may not be able to be brought up on the fly since we're having a weird kind of technical day today. But at the same time, shading can change. It can depend a lot on what we can get done as far as like how much we want those regular lines, how open it has to be, and how detailed it has to be. So let's just bring this up because we're having some issues with stuff. Like I said, I'm having some stuff happening with the feed that I'd rather not mess up. These are done here. This shading is done strictly just with lines. So this is just directly drawn. Why is it directly drawn? I knew that I was going to change my inflection a couple times, and I wanted to make sure that I was drawing a path because I was literally traveling from one object to the next, and I wanted to make sure in that traveling run that I started where I wanted to, ended where I wanted to, didn't have any extraneous stitches. It was fairly small, and I knew the number of points I had to click wasn't much, so I literally drew it out. I just drew this out line by line, no big deal. Also, this was never going to be at a different scale. This was one scale. I didn't intend to scale it. Why might I worry about that? Well, because if you take a piece of shading that you draw manually like this, and I'll just talk about it very briefly. If you rescale a piece like this, as you scale it up, because it does not add more lines, it cannot change the density. Now it is more sparse than it used to be. It was very solid at this size. If we blow it up, it's less solid now than it was. The density has changed. Whereas if I use a filled object, and this is just a filled object, I would just take it out of here. And this is an old school one where I didn't break out much of the fill. If I take this filled object and I change that object, obviously it stays the same density because it's a density that was set in software. And that's why I might want to use a fill, even for shading, because you might find like what I really want for shading is 50% of one color over the other one. Well, if I want that, then another filled area on top of it that is at that 50% rate, it will still be at 50% of color coverage if I scale it, because the software will refill that shape with the piece. So like I said, the choice of drawing tool, and this is once again a good choice that actually is on topic to a good degree, the choice of drawing tool between using a fill tool, right, using a fill object and drawing it manually, does have to do with whether or not I'm going to scale it and what will happen if I have to scale the piece. And now, like I said, there's a couple other objects I'm going to bring up fairly quickly just to show you what I'm talking about. Like I talked a little about node count earlier, and in that case, you guys know I usually use fairly low node counts. I do pretty minimal point placement when I draw. I've talked also about some things between like redrawing and tracing versus bringing in vectors. So I talked about import. But one of the things I do see argued is like, if there's more points, it's bad. It's always bad. Like I said earlier, talking about that editing, more points just makes it harder to edit curves. And incorrect points, too many points too close together, can cause bad output. However, extra nodes that are on a curve that are cleanly made don't necessarily cause the output to turn bad. The trick to knowing that is the node actually defining the line correctly, and how close together they are, is the software having trouble working with them? A lot of the times when people are saying extra nodes are bad, what they're actually saying is auto-converted nodes, poorly made vector, freehand drawn stuff that's really complicated, so it's causing issues with the stitch generation. They're looking at it and going, you got too many nodes. The problem isn't necessarily too many nodes. It's either bad nodes or nodes that are telling the software to do something that isn't working for the file. Whereas I'm going to show you very briefly an example of a place where extra nodes helps, right? So let's go ahead and bring Zuber back up really quickly. And I'm going to show you something just randomly that I realized. We were talking about this before, a place where extra nodes helps. You guys know I've been talking about enveloping text a lot recently. It had come up repeatedly, so I thought I wanted to share this little kind of example where node count is actually good, extra node count. If we're looking at these two samples, I don't think you have to argue really hard which one of these is doing a better job filling the envelope, right? If we look at this envelope tool, we've got a nice little envelope here. We're trying to fill with letters. In this case, it's just a bunch of E's because that's a nice letter that has a big flat top and bottom. And this is a font of mine that I've done that I call Hard Cider. It was based on an original called Craft Brew from a guy called H64 that he put out royalty free. So I decided to play with it. And it's something that I use as a test bed. And I'm going to show you something that looks like they're similar, but the two fonts look different. Here's my original creation out of that font. So there is Craft Brew, the original. Let's take a look at our E in Craft Brew. If we grab our E and we start looking at points on the E, what are we going to notice? Well, what we're going to notice is we've got minimal point placement. I have a nice flat line here. It's also set up with a line node, so it's a complete direct flat line from one point to the next. And that is the same case over here. It's definitely edited. You can see I've changed some things from the original font and the way it was created. But at the same time, we do have these nice flat lines in placement. Well, that's the original file that became a Hard Cider, the one that I often show you guys in testing. Well, I have a different version that I call Craft Brew for enveloping. Why did I do that? Because I wanted to be able to do really crazy tight envelopes with it that had weird curvatures. And if we look at this piece, what's the difference here? Well, if I get to that E, what do I have in that E? I have more points. I've got curvature points all along this line. Is this line any less straight because those are there? No, because if we look at the curve handles, they're exactly flat across the line. They don't create a curvature. There are just more points that are in there. So we have more points at which we could alter the line. So for editing, this is not the best piece. If I was going to edit this a bunch, well, if I wanted to move that line, well, now I'm stuck moving the line and moving every little point, and that's not the best. Yes, if I were moving it all as one line, maybe I'd be great. It wouldn't be a big deal because I'd grab them all, select them, and move them. But if I want to change the angle of this line, well, now I'm going to have to tweak every little point. So you'd say that is a fail for editing, right? Yeah, maybe it's a fail for editing. But for doing crazy tight envelopes, top font is Hard Cider made from that original where I have tons of hard points and the lines are only one line from point to point and hard nodes, whereas the bottom one is Craft Brew enveloping, because it has the curve nodes built in, because it has more of those nodes. The warping that happens in the envelope actually covers that area. Maybe it's not the best font to do it in, and I could do some differences to that font to make it work better, and I might even edit the objects later by grabbing this thing and breaking those objects out. But you can't argue that even this really tight, weird curve that's happening here, we actually get a very nice following line where it does the warping properly. This is a very specific use case in which extra nodes, too many nodes, makes it work better for the intended purpose. So why do I bring that up? It's not to say, hey, make all of your fonts with a ton of nodes. Not necessarily. It'd be really annoying to someone who's trying to do, maybe they're going to grab that font, break it apart, and use that piece to then edit those letters and to tweak the angles of that piece. They'll probably go in there and delete all those nodes out if you make it for enveloping. But if you're making it for enveloping and you intend for it to be warped, and that's the point of the thing, then you might want to mess with it and have those nodes in there. If you intended for that to be the use, more nodes is the absolute right answer. Is it the right answer all the time? No. That's why I kind of put the debate up in quotes. That's why the big versus graphic isn't really a thing. More nodes versus less nodes is about ease of use. It's about clarity, and it's about whether or not it's generating properly. If the stitches are generating properly, more nodes versus less nodes, let's put it this way at least, it's not the cardinal sin I've seen some people make it out to be. What they're really trying to tell you is if you're having weird generation that's not working for you, you probably have a weird excess node that's not doing what it should, right? That's the thing. You're probably having something that's not working for you as far as those nodes. And the likelihood is you'd be better off if you didn't have that set up that way. I mean, that's really what it is. You need to clean that input up so that the software can interpret it correctly. You might have only one node that's causing the problem and not need to redraw everything, even if you have a tremendous number of points. Minimal points in that case, it's not necessary to have minimal points or to have what we sometimes call prime point placement, whereas where we're orienting ourselves on a clock as we draw and everything is at the 3, 6, 9 as to the curves. It's an interesting thing to do. I've actually taught it before. A guy named Von Glitchko, who's an excellent designer and illustrator, teaches prime point placement, where we think about drawing any curve as being on a clock, and we want a point at the 12 and the 3 and the 6, and then we adjust our curve through that point. That is a fantastic way to think about having your points placed correctly for a curve so they are very clean and nice and easy to edit. For the purposes of embroidery, number one, since embroidery is a much fuzzier thing, and by that I mean there's more distortion and alteration that happens in the process, and for the purposes of making a curve that you're not intending to edit, that you're making for the embroidery, not for it to be reused in any way, not for it to become a cutter object later, not for it to be edited by a third party who might want to change things that you aren't intending. More points or using the spline method really isn't a problem, right? And it's the same kind of thing we're talking about, like traditional tools versus vector style tools. And what I mean by that is there are tools that are made for embroidery, like a ladder entry, a 2-point entry where you're doing left side, right side column stitch entry. That is made for satin stitches, and it makes it much quicker for you to be able to edit and digitize satin stitches, or at least not to edit, but to digitize satin stitches very quickly, because every time we drop that set of points, we also get an implied angle line, and we don't have to drop all of our angles after the fact, because we are essentially making something that is made to be a ribbon-like satin stitch-like object. Makes it very quick to use. Drawing that same object with a vector style tool, where we're drawing around the edge instead of side to side. I mean, show that again if you really want to. That isn't a better or a worse object, especially in modern software where objects can be converted from one type to another. It just is about what makes more sense for your drawing style and how quickly you can do the work, because a lot of it, especially when we're talking about the concept of doing this commercially, a lot of that is really about how quickly can I do the entry, because it's about not spending extra time doing that entry portion of it, the digitizing portion of it, because we want to get to stitching. We want to get to the actual process of doing it. So like I said, I'll bring this up just very quickly. Traditional tools, when I say traditional tools, I mean like this two-sided entry. There's other things. Fill tools are those as well. If we're looking at like Wilcom, the Wilcom software will have tools that are made for fill, and then we'll also have a closed object or a open object, and those are kind of analogous to vector style tools. But a sided entry, it's where we are saying, okay, left side, right side, left side, right side. And as we go, we are building a satin stitch. And when we end it, we have built in already our angles are there, our points are there, and we have a left and right side. Now, I made a big junky looking satin stitch out of it, and we can edit this in any way we want to, but it makes the satin stitch already have our inclinations on it. It's immediately set that way, and we're thinking like a satin stitch. We're not defining this end or this end. And why aren't we? Because a satin stitch will always have a flat end. Even when we talk about a curved or a curved font that may have those ends, a rounded font that has a rounded end, at the end of that rounded point, no matter what we do, eventually we're going to get to this point where there is a flat line, which is the edge of a single stitch. A satin stitch has two flat ends always, and then it can have whatever in the middle. We can have curves, we can have whatever we want between these. That does not matter. That's not going to change anything. We can certainly have curve, but we're always going to have two flat ends on the side. So drawing it with that tool can be very quick for folks. Doing fonts or text that way is very quick. Whereas, is there any difference necessarily to me drawing it like this? Now, in this case, I'll go ahead and put a dot in the middle where I wasn't before. I wasn't going to put a node there if I was drawing it myself, but let's say I do. Does it make a difference that I did this and then grab my angle tools and drop it? A little slower, maybe a little more precise for me. If I was doing it the way I usually would do it, I wouldn't probably have dropped those points in there, because I can do that with one curve on a nice curve like this that doesn't have any reversals or any sort of tweaking in that curved line. So yeah, no. Are these different? Yes, this one looks junky because I wasn't paying a lot of attention to what I was doing. But no, ultimately, do these make a very, very different shape? Does the stitch generation vary a ton between the two? Absolutely not. These tools are just done for different reasons. You can use this tool to draw more different shapes than you can this tool. The tool that is made for a satin stitch is very good at making satin stitches. Yes, can I use that with fills type stitching? For sure, but it is very much intended for and is best used making columnar stitching that is like as a rectangle, a column, a ribbon-like object. That is what it's for. It makes them very well. It makes them very quickly. It's good to use it for that kind of entry. Fast. Easy to define your two sides, and you get angles built in. And if you're making matched pairs, which I didn't do an awesome job of doing this because it really would be better for them to be directly matched, and we have that inclination line going right through that matched pair, we know we've got a nice, fairly perpendicular angle going through all of those stitch points, going through all of that column, making a nice satin stitch. Whereas in this one, I'm setting my angles after the fact. And if I were jerky and not paying attention, I could certainly put a skewed angle in there when I get some kind of weird interactions with that piece, especially if I was doing a ton of angles going through this piece where it was a much more complicated curve. But the difference between using those two pieces, those two tools, really isn't that different. Like I said, it's not much different between the two. Same with Bezier versus spline type entry. In the end, if I get the shape I want, if the angles are right, and if I'm paying attention to the way the stitches generate and how they fill the space, I'm going to be all right, and I'm going to be able to make nice stitching. I'm not going to have a problem making that stitch work. And like I said, there's multiple ways to do it. There's different columns, there's different entry methods. All of these are valid. Really, the difference is in how you want to do that editing work, how you want to do the drawing work, and if we get the output we want. If we get the output we want, ultimately it's cool. People, quote unquote, misuse tools all the time. If the stitches generate in a way that they stitch correctly, that they're not causing extraneous like underlay to pop out, like Mike's earlier problem with zigzags going off at sharp points, if that stuff's not happening, you're fairly in the clear, right? The one thing I will say is, why do I not use maybe auto tracing or SVG conversion or vector conversion or import of any kind? Why do I not do that? Because most of the time, like I showed in this example, I want two columns to represent something that in the art is a single shape. And if I want that, then honestly, I'm not going to get that from the original art. I'm not going to get that from tracing those areas. And frankly, the shapes that are in vector, the shapes that are visible in print, aren't the shapes I actually need for embroidery. I want that flat end because I know what it's going to do. And let's say I'm working on this piece. I know I want to be under this other column. I'm eventually going to have this second column run over the top. So let's say I'm working on that column here. I might start here and say I've got, I actually deleted my point, but you know what I'm saying here. I'm going to have a piece where I'm going to run under this. Maybe I want to go almost 50% under there, and I might mess with those ends that I had, but here's my other flat end because I know it's going to push into that border. I know I want to be at least 50% under this other satin border that's actually going to be here. And I know I want to cut off that point. I don't want a little tiny sharp point. And in fact, I'll back it up even further than this when I get done, because I know that I'm going to have a little bit of push and then I'm going to have a satin border here, right? So let's say, and I can delete that, doesn't need to be there. This can even be, we can cusp that on both sides so that I can have a curvature if I want to have a little bit of curvature here to expand this into this piece. But what I know is, I know where this is going in sequence. This is before the satin stitch that I'm going to have on top of it. Kind of know what angle I want. I'm going to play with that as I go. It's okay to edit after the fact. Do I have prime point placement on this? Absolutely not. Doesn't matter that much. Is there minimal nodes? Absolutely not. I could do this with fewer nodes for sure. Is it going to be fine once I generate this? Absolutely. No problem with what I've generated here. Got my start point here. I end here. And I know I want an overlap because I want some texture between the two of these. I'll mess with underlay later, not necessary to mess with it now. But the other thing I will do is I'll go in for my next shape. I know that it's going to go through here. We're going to be overlapping over into the border. We'll cut it a little early. In this case, I'm not cutting it quite as early as I should, and I got my wrong point here. Let's go ahead and back that up. Who cares? You back up. You do things as you're working. You might have to edit. Things happen, right? Not a big deal. Want a flat at the end. Doesn't really need to have a curvature, a point there, because we're going to generate a whole stitch. We're not going to generate little tiny stitches. And in this case, I probably would overlap deeper into, but let's just pretend that we're ending right at that. And then we're going to have a thin border on here later. I've done it very spline method. I didn't do it in a vector method. I used extra lines, no big, or extra points on the line, no big deal. We're doing it correctly. We close off our shape. And I'm going to go ahead and say, all right, here's these angles. I'm going to follow this curvature here. Going to lay down a little bit here so I have a longer stitch at the end. And as I fill that in, those are nice satin stitches. They break pretty well where I wanted to break. I think if I was going to play with this again, I would look and see if that curvature is everything I want it to be. Might have to change it. And since we have this started here, ends here, I want to make sure I'm starting right at that end since I'm not having to travel. Maybe I'll end here and then travel back manually, or I could end here if I'm going up into this third column. In the case of the actual piece, this column under here was also underneath. But if you look at the shapes that I have here, no tracing is going to give me this. No input from a vector that was originally there is going to give me this. I can't get those nice little overlaps that I want. I can't work on this piece in that way or have that texture without using other tools. In the case of embroidery, this stuff is just not going to work the same way. And now as I go in, I would go and do my border after the fact. Not something I'm going to go through and digitize the entire piece, but I did want to show you, really, that's where we start having the critical decisions between tools. Does the tool make the embroidery you want? Does it make it in a technical way that's going to run? Does it allow you to have creative control over what you're doing? Are you going to end up with something flat, or are you going to end up with something with a little bit of texture? Do you want to use stitches differently than the printer was using ink, right? The person who was printing this piece intended those slabs because they had to do it for ink. And in that case, I was doing it in a decorative way. And like I showed you before, and I can bring that back up one more time just to make the case. If we look at that vector, there's also just things that don't work at all for embroidery. The vector, like I said, has that big slab of white. Eventually, I want to use that to make a border. But the sad truth is that if I use the vector that we have from the original, that slab of white that we have here is not only connected to everything, we don't have a border piece. This piece is a different object that also is in under this entire piece. I'd have to stamp it out, cut it apart, break it away from this text. And as we found out in the final piece and in a lot of the final pieces, I didn't use the same text on all of them and had to have a different color breakout for that text. So having this piece is pretty useless because even if I want to make these letters, I may have to create the rest of what's missing to create overlaps that are going to make sense for me. So like I said, it's more about what's going to make the function happen, what's going to get us the embroidery we want, than it is about a right tool or a wrong tool. So to tie this all up, just going to make it clear, yes, there is a debate. We all debate over it. I actually use different tools depending on what I'm intending to do or what tools I'm using as far as, like I said, mouse versus pen sometimes even will make me use things a little differently because the entry is easier or harder. But the debate, I kind of put in quotes. Yes, we debate, but the ultimate thing to understand is tool choice is personal or is set by your intention, what you're trying to get done with the file and with the embroidery. We're choosing between spline and Bezier. Either way is going to work for you. Spline, to get the curves, we need more points. More points means when we want to make subtle adjustments to that curve, probably a little harder to make those subtle adjustments without introducing some bumpiness in that curve as we move each of those individual points around. And in fact, you may just want to redefine that curve. Bezier is great for handling curves like that where they're nice and smooth. However, there can be some folks who have a hard time figuring out the correlation between pulling those handles and getting the curve you want. Freehand tools work, but they're better for organic shapes. And you have to remember, unlike the embroidery tools or the vector style tools that are used for drawing objects, doesn't take into account the fact that all stitches, all satins, all fills eventually have a flat end somewhere. So we can get weird generation if we do a lot of weird little curving points. It's great for organic stuff that's big enough that that kind of generation won't cause problems. Little fine detail work. Also, if we're working at a very micro scale, you may find that the smoothing that's in your software, and you can adjust it depending on your software, may smooth out little details you draw and you get really frustrated. In the case you're working at that micro scale, freehand really isn't your tool anyway. You're going to need more precision. You're going to have to learn how to use either spline, drawing with points, or a Bezier style tool, or like I said, drawing with points and then editing in Bezier. So that's the thing to take into account, right? For node count, less nodes, probably easier to edit overall. More nodes, probably easier to draw in the spline method. But it's the bad nodes, the malformed nodes, the twisted ones, the doubled nodes on top of each other that will sometimes cause weird generation that you don't like, as well as shapes that just don't work well for embroidery. Like Mike said, like I showed you, really fine points, really tiny curves at the end of something where you can't even see that curvature until you zoom in on it, will cause weird generation in those very small areas, especially as those vector style objects that you've already drawn or that come in from an import are smaller than stitches should reliably work. When we're getting into these sub-millimeter curves and points and things like that, you'll find that many of them are just too small for good generation for the software, which is fine because they're really just too small to stitch in the way that they were drawn in the first place. The drawing wasn't made for embroidery, it was made for print or digital most of the time, and you are doing the interpretation yourself. So think about it. It's creation versus editing. You want to create fast, you don't need to edit much. Splines, multiple points are going to be fine. Just make sure they're clean, that you're not putting weird curves and points, and that you're not having like points right on top of each other kinds of generation like that that are bothersome. That's the thing. Creation versus editing. Creating can be faster with more points to spline. Editing is probably faster with vector with more controlled point placement. But I'll say this, when we're talking about vector import versus what we sometimes call redrawing. So vector import versus redrawing, or sometimes people say tracing, but we're making new shapes that don't necessarily look exactly like the edges of the art. So tracing is not kind of a misnomer. Bringing in the art and drawing on top of it, that is going to allow us to think as embroiderers and as an embroidery machine to format shapes in a way that makes sense for embroidery and to draw the actual shapes we need to deal with overlaps that we need for pull compensation, to deal with cutting back so we can deal with push compensation, to cut away areas that don't need to be under other areas in the case that we have art that's brought in and it literally is just slabs on top of slabs and they didn't cut away. At least the piece you saw there was flattened with not a bunch of extra stuff under it. Many pieces of art made for print, you'll find the rest of the letters underneath it or parts of the shape underneath things that are on top, because when you send them to the printer does not make any sort of attempt to interpret things that are underneath the face of the object. Vector can often be drawn for print and have layers and layers on top of it with stuff underneath that doesn't make sense, that has nothing to do with what the final piece looks like, but that were used in the process of building the shapes. When we're doing that redrawing ourselves, we are making shapes that are tuned for embroidery, that are made exactly how we need them, with the thought of what stitches do and how they work in mind. So like I said, don't worry too much about prime point placement. Yes, I've taught it before as a way to help you do minimal points, to do really clean vectors that edit nicely. At the same time, minimal points is not something to chase like a badge of honor. It is something that we use to make pieces easier to edit, to make them clean and run well, but that sometimes multiple points make sense, and especially can make sense for efficiency. And as it comes to either drawing at once, if you're somebody who wants to put all your points in and have it exactly right as you draw on screen, or placing points and editing later, neither of these makes a better object. I find that the drawing at once is nice and fast. And in that case, I'm going to use the spline method. Placing and editing, I'm going to edit Bezier curves and I'll get a nice clean line. But either of these is fine because honestly, no matter which one you use, I find you're going to do a little bit of editing on the back end anyway. So with that, folks, we're going to go ahead and end that now. Like I said, you may have different opinions on it. I'd love to hear your opinions in general. But frankly, the truth is that many of these methods work, and it's all about the output and how things work for the generation of stitches that matters the most. Think about where this file is going. Think about what you may or may not want to change in the future, and you might make some different decisions. But ultimately, the produce of the digitizer is embroidery, not the file. And what makes the best embroidery is going to be the right choice for you. And what makes you either faster or able to do the creative stuff you want is going to be fine, provided you're making stitches that the machine can handle. So think about how stitches work. Think about how the piece should be, but understand where you're going. And in fact, hey, you love importing vector and editing it anyway. If you find that's the efficient way for you to go, once again, it's not a cardinal sin. In the end, if you get the shapes that make the sense for stitching, that's for you. For me, I'll probably draw the stuff some more. But you know what? I've been doing this a while. All right, folks. With that, thank you for being here. I know that was a topic where we got a little into the weeds and how things work, but hopefully it helped you to think about how you draw. And hopefully for those of you who are struggling with drawing, you stopped and thought, hey, the tools are there for me and what I need to do. It's not a prescription of what I must do. And you can start to think more about how shapes affect the way it generates stitches and how stitches work. That's the real key. So get out there, make something cool, draw something for yourself, do a self-directed project if you have some time, and make some time if you can, and try some stuff out. You may find that an entry method you didn't use before is your favorite now. I know. I use splines for everything for years, and now I do a lot of vector style, Bezier style editing. I could have sworn that I would do that years ago, but now I do. You might find that it works better for some of the stuff that you're trying to do. All right, get out there, test stuff, have some fun, and don't worry about ruining some garments. It's all part of the process, and you got to love the process on the way. All right, folks, next week, you may not see me here. I will be out in Fort Worth for Impressions Expo. So, Impressions Expo happening in Fort Worth. I am teaching a class on Thursday morning more about selling and presenting embroidery, but I will be present at Impressions Expo, doing meetings, seeing people, taking in what's new and what's good out there. I will try and give you guys some updates, but a classic show like this is definitely not happening next week. Might get a little pre-record, might get a live update. Depends on how internet goes and how things work out there while we're traveling. But I will see you again for sure. Hey, at least the week after next, but you'll hear from me again somehow next week.